Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a progressive campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We work with non-profit and community-based organisations, trade unions, businesses and social democratic parties across the globe to develop campaign strategies, train engagement staff in leadership and power building, and help you execute your campaign with data-driven tactics and actions. And in 2022, Dunn Street will continue to work with folks that want to share their stories, inspire others, take action and organise communities for change. To find out how you can partner with Dunn Street, hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also proudly brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Are you highly organised and love working in a fast-paced environment? Maurice Blackburn, Australia's leading plaintiff law firm, is looking for an executive legal assistant to support a national leader on a 12-month fixed-term contract based here in Melbourne. This will include coordinating and supporting the leader with high-level administration, coordinating documents with strong attention to detail, building and managing relationships with key internal and external stakeholders, and providing excellent client service. To apply, simply go to mauriceblackburn.com.au/careers. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast out every Friday that dives into the campaigns and the people leading them from home and abroad. And we're finishing off our post-election wrap-up, and we're finishing with the state in the West, Western Australia, that came home for us on election night and brought the seats needed to get us over the line to get to 76 and elect an Albanese Labor government. So we're going to be talking to Lenda Oshalem, a good mate of mine who is a former party official and now is one of the senior partners at Newgate, and she's going to be unpacking the WA results. And actually a little bit different to some of the other episodes, probably Lenda, given that she's been working in Labor Party politics and campaigns in the West for over a decade now, she can sort of track back to where the change in Western Australia began. And I think that's a really interesting insight, some key takeaways for the rest of us in the way that we want to set up our party and win election campaigns and build for the future. So enjoyed the chat with Lenda today. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Stitcher. And if you like the show, be sure to give us 5 stars on Apple Podcast. And when you're done listening to today's episode, leave us a review. And for all the updates, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and LinkedIn. Let's get to today's episode. We're taping this one on a Friday afternoon on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and this is our last of 6 episodes where we've been doing a post-election debrief state by state, and I always save the best for last. And so we're going to look at Western Australia, and to help me unpack that is former ALPWA Assistant Secretary and now a Director for Newgate, and she's joining me on the line from Perth. Lenda Oshalem, welcome back to Socially Democratic.
Woo! Hi, it's good to be back.
It is good to be back. Now, the last time I saw you obviously was on our live telecast. And I can I tell you that it was just so much fun watching you give us the reports on all the seats live. It was brilliant. I remember we were sort of communicating to the control room via Slack, and they were the ones who were telling us where we need to go next. And I was writing back, going, no, stick with this. This is good. This is really good. You were so up and about, and obviously, you were sitting. I'm assuming you were sitting in front of your computer, and you were actually looking at the back end of the results coming through from the party, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and your eyes was darting all over the screen going, oh my God, this is coming in and now this is coming in and wait, just give me a minute, and there's a party going on behind you. It was just fantastic television. I loved every moment of it.
It's wild swings. It was good fun. And I looked over at one point because a few of the seats were starting to get called and everybody was cheering. And I looked over at the team who was sitting quite quietly and just sort of, celebrating to themselves. And we're in a sort of corner room of a back party. And I said, why aren't you guys cheering? And they kind of all pointed over, and there was a pack of journalists all sitting on the other side, and everyone's trying to be a little bit on their best behaviour to start the night. And I thought, oh, okay. I wondered why we weren't sort of up and about getting very active, but I was looking around and all the noise was in the sort of background. But it was just such an amazing night. And I remember thinking to myself, I messaged you afterwards as I thought, geez, I didn't do your telecast live stream much justice, because instead of giving you insights, I just kept looking at everything going, this is crazy. This is nothing I've seen before at a federal level here.
I loved it. I really did. It was raw emotion. And it just really brought, Western Australia brought the result home for us. It was just fantastic to be a part of, really. I loved all of it. So let's unpack it, shall we? Now, as we've been doing in all the other episodes, so let's have a look at the overall sort of state of the states to party preferred. There was a 10.4% swing to the Labor Party on 2PP. So they finished up with 54.9, almost 55% of the share of the vote, and the coalition dropped to 45.1. That is what I call an ass kicking. In the primaries, Labor led in the primaries. It's the only state across the country where Labor was ahead on raw votes, primary votes, over the coalition. They had a swing of 7% to them, took them up to 36.8%, and they picked up. They now hold 9 seats out of the 15 in WA, and picked up 4. Coalition had a 10.4% swing against them on their primary, lost 5 seats, and they're fallen to 38.4. Greens, like a percentage point increase on primary. One Nation, a swing against them of 1.5%, and United Australia picked up 0.3, so hardly anything. And then the others, which we'll probably talk a little bit about, they picked up a seat and had a swing of 3.6% to take their primary up to 9.7. So, just a really good result for Labor. A 7% swing on Labor on their primary is just fantastic for Western Australian Labor. What was your overall reaction to the results at a statewide level?
Oh, it is truly, it filled me with joy that WA was able to sort of bring it home for the national ALP, and it is quite something to be proud of as Western Australians. I think even if you go out there in the community and you talk to people who are not diehard Labor supporters, they would even say to you that it is great to have such an impact as a state. So as a WA first approach, it is definitely something to be proud of. Now, these swings, I've been listening to to the episodes of every other jurisdiction, and there's a lot to unpack about what's happened in certain areas, and whether there was differences between inner city and outer suburban, and what's going on in Queensland. And I think it's very complicated and complex, and it's lots of challenging issues and so on. But and there's lots to dissect. But when I look at WA, it's fairly straightforward. So I've looked at every single seat had anywhere between a 8% and a 11% swing on the 2PP towards the Labor Party, and that swing on a primary is directly taken off the Liberal Party. Now, when I first came to WA in 2012, I remember we did the 2013 state election, 2013 Fed election, had a lot of really good practical experience on the ground campaigning, but not a really good result. And we looked at, in the lead up to the Senate by-election in 2014, we looked at what was happening in Western Australia with the Labor vote over time. And I remember my partner actually produced a graph to show that since the 80s, the primary for the Labor Party has been on a steady decline in both lower houses and upper houses at a state and federal level in Western Australia, with the exception of one state election result with Jeff Gallop won the state government, and really, and in the 80s when Bob Hawke was Prime Minister, and really it was just this pretty depressing graph that you'd look at as a steady decline of the vote that went to its lowest primary ever in the Senate by-election in 2014, where it went down to 23%. And I remember looking at that and saying, the only way is up. We have really got to start to change the way we operate as a party, and we could talk about some of these lessons later on. But the investment in training and building up our campaign capacity, I think that's borne through fruit. This is now almost 10 years on. Labor has been on a steady growth trajectory now in Western Australia. Is it something that I ever thought was possible, that Western Australia could be such a red state? No, and it is amazing to see. But one of the things I remember often is back then the opposition leader Mark McGowan would always say, the recipe is simple. The recipe is very simple. We don't need to overcomplicate it. For us to win, we need to take votes off the Liberal Party. And I remember at the time thinking, fantastic, what a it's such a very simple way to just explain to people, the core ambition. The objective here is to take votes off them. But I think just having that in the back of your mind consistently year on year, every campaign, is pointing towards has sort of played out in Western Australia. We're not fighting third parties. We're not fighting minorities. We're not fighting minority parties. Sorry, we're not fighting the Greens. We're fighting the Liberal Party, and everything we do is about standing up for WA here in Western Australia, and it's not about and it's about sort of marking our key difference of what does Labor Party stand for versus what does Liberal Party stand for. Now, it's a small state. It's simple to say, but I think the work and the effort and the focus on that has paid dividends over time.
Well, I'm going to change the run sheet here, because I know normally what we do is we then start to unpack some of those seats we picked up. But let's go with that. What do you think? What would you say has been some of the significant changes that happened going back to that 2012, 2013, 14 experience? Where do you see the foundational changes that led to this result today?
2014, you would remember, is the year that I came to you in Victoria and said, what are you guys doing? Because we're very interested over here looking at your hordes and hordes of volunteers and everybody having fun, and your policy, a bold and brave policy agenda that was communicated so clearly and simply to Victorians, and that led such a wave of change through the country. And I remember spending some time with you and spending a lot of time reading up about field campaigning and about the way to build a movement. Basically, how do you achieve true change? And I say we, but I say me, but it is actually a group task. WA Labor got its shit together. And the number one thing it did is it invested in training. The Labor movement in its entirety invested and supported the party to roll out significant amounts of training in at every level, and for any person who wanted to be part of a campaign, no matter the role they chose, whether it was candidates, and we ran training programs, that were getting people who were interested in being candidates to experience what that might be like and to understand what that might be like, so that they made a more informed decision about whether they wanted to take that on. We ran training sessions for volunteers on how they could be part of campaigns. We ran training sessions for electorate officers and staff members who wanted to better service their members of parliament in terms of community engagement and how to kind of listen to the community. And I think I wrote down, I wanted to kind of bring it back to three things. It was the significant investment in training, community organising and development, and focus on it. And so much so that the culture of the party became a hot competition of like, how many doors had you knocked? And, my favourite is actually listening to whenever Senator Sue Lyons is responsible for a campaign, any meeting she's in, her first contribution to that meeting will be, my candidate's just knocked on this many doors, and by the way, our campaign's just made this many phone calls, so thank you very much, and we're going home. And so I think that focus there was great, and what it also sort of permeated through the party is a need for discipline. Like, separately, I've been reviewing the Tasmanian branch of the ALP, and I've got to say that from afar, I look over at Tasmania, and there's a lot of similarities for where WA was, a decade ago, and more so. And what it needs is a hit of discipline. Everybody's just got to have a common purpose and a common goal of, we've got to win. We've got to win because it's better for the state. We've got to win because we've got some great policies that we need to implement. We've got to win because we know that our movement as a whole can work together to do a lot of really good things for the state. And I think we got that in 2014. There was just in 2014 and 2015, there was just these moments where the party just sort of looked at each other and went, let's shake ourselves up now and instill a level of discipline where the ultimate priority is about making sure we get elected so that we could deliver. It's all well and good to have great policies, but it doesn't matter unless you're in government. So it was about staying focused on getting elected in order to be able to do the good things that we're doing. And those policies were not last minute, final week of the election campaign, drop something in the hope that you think it could pick people up. Those policies have been developed over time. We established something called the Fighting Platform, which brought the unions, the rank and file, the parliamentarians together to talk constructively about the kind of policies and platform and the agenda they wanted to see for government. And it was about listening to the community through our community engagement, through research, and through our members of parliament engaging and visiting their stakeholders and talking to people and feeding back in what works, what do people need, what are people looking for from government, how do you present an agenda that is bold and ambitious but not crazy enough to make people think that we're going to, rip the carpet from under their feet or change everything and turn it on its head. So how do you present a sensible, centrist, but yet progressive policy agenda in a way that is, again, clearly communicated to people and that builds hope and inspires people to change? So I think that training, discipline, and that community-first approach to policy and to the campaigns and to the things that we did really drove a massive change that I think, with a couple of other circumstantial things, and I cannot at all dismiss the exceptional popularity rating of Mark McGowan that was garnered by a love and support of the community built over the COVID period. Like, I cannot at all dismiss that there are some very big circumstantial things that also contribute to it. But, it all comes together into this big moment where, WA delivers federal government for the Labor Party, and it's just something to be truly proud of as a state and as a party. And for me personally, as a party official who thought I'd come here, do a state election, fed election, and try to hightail back to New South Wales, but here we are in the great Labor state of Western Australia.
You say it with such glee, and so you should. Let's so much there to unpack, and I want to start with the training things. I do remember quite fondly when you did come over to Victoria in 2014. I think it would have been like September, so we weren't that far away from that win the vote phase. And you came over with a number of other interstate colleagues from all the different branches to have a look at what we were doing in terms of developing the Community Action Network and our field program and the like. And the one person that I thought had the biggest takeaways from what they were seeing was you. And you obviously went back to WA and sought about implementing a lot of the things that you saw in Victoria, and not that we weren't crushing it, and nor have we still. There's still a long way to go. You always have to continue to learn and develop. But certainly watching it then being implemented in WA in the lead up to that first McGowan election was really, really inspiring to watch and validating as well. And now as much as I do the challenges that it is to get people within the party leadership to embrace this type of campaigning and to resource it. I don't want to get this wrong, but I think that the Victorian branch and the WA branch are the only two branches that have an actual training director to support the field program, or have had in the past. I know that the Vic branch doesn't have one right now, but they're looking to get someone for the state campaign. But what kind of challenges did you encounter, and how did you overcome, or did you encounter challenges, or were people very open to this idea like this? We need to continue to develop all of our activists and grow that resource.
Yeah, I think for me, it was, I remember you saying, I have this perpetual fear. I need to remind myself that this thing's being recorded, but it's okay. I think I'll just use it to do my confessions to Stephen Donnelly. I have this perpetual fear that I'll get recruited by a cult because I'm just ready to go. If there is a team and people want to kind of like jump in, pitch in, help out, I am ready to go. And I remember in Victoria, you said it is a cult, but it's a good cult. And I walked away thinking, let's make campaigning fun. Your volunteers, this was the sort of experience when I went and saw it. So there was, it was fantastic to see the community engagement. It was fantastic to see, people learn how to very simply and clearly articulate policies and insert their personal story and their values to make those conversations very persuasive. And it was amazing, right, to watch all of that, what I call the kind of flow-on effects out of a really good community organising model. But the thing that I actually took away was people were having fun and enjoying themselves working on a campaign and calling strangers and having conversations with them and sharing their personal stories with them, and then sort of hanging up and going, I just had this fantastic conversation with this random individual about, my daily challenge of taking my kids to school. And I remember feeling, how great is that? And I wondered whether we could recreate that sense of joy and that sense of fulfillment and that sort of really meaningful work when people come in and volunteer. And what I absolutely loved, what I saw in Victoria, what I absolutely loved about it was more than just party members. It was more, and our own party members were getting reinvigorated by the fact that new people were coming along and they were able to sort of talk to a wider range of people about their interests in politics. And it was just exciting. And so I think when I came back here, the party was ready for that excitement. The party was ready to move out of, talking about losing elections and doing reviews where we constantly say how we could have done better. The party, the branches, the members, the supporters, when you get out and about, they were over it. They were talking about wanting to, move beyond unpicking all of the kind of problems that always occur and just start talking about what we need to do to get on and fix it. And so the timing was right to pitch to people about this really meaningful way of campaigning that has an ability to kind of drive even the above the line campaign, in that there'd be great symmetries around a values-based discussion, inserting and using personal story, and doing that from a leader to a candidate to a minister to a shadow minister down to a volunteer, and doing that consistently throughout the party would just make a massive difference in the way we campaign and the way we pitch campaigns and pitch our agenda and pitch our message to voters, compared to what we've done in the past, which is just sort of list facts and figures and tell people there's a bank of policies on the website, feel free to go and read them. So I think that excitement was the clearest and fastest way to motivate people, and it certainly motivated me. And then the more I talked about it to others, the more it motivated others, and people wanted to buy in. We had amazing support from across the party. Patrick Gorman, State Secretary, fantastic support for this new way of community organising and campaigning. The leadership of the party stepped up and said, door knocks and calls, these are the things that we need to do to get over the line, get some training, get involved. And they were part of it. And they'd come in. I remember we ran in the 2015 Canning by-election. Because the by-election got called at a certain time and we kind of had no choice, but we had to keep our scheduled conference. So we had this 2-day conference in the middle of a by-election. I'm sure you could appreciate how much of a nerve-wracking thing that was. But we actually had, we turned it into a campaign activity, and we ran the world's biggest phone bank. So 2 days, there was a centre adjacent to the conference room where everybody would pile in, and we just made thousands and thousands of calls into the Canning electorate as part of the by-election. We had this giant thermometer at the front of the conference stage, and every time we hit another 1,000, we'd colour that in. Anyway, I'm telling you these wonderful stories because I think it's easier in hindsight to look at everything about how well it all went. The challenges, though, was about making sure everybody felt that they had a part in it, and that might mean giving people the opportunity to invest in the program and choose how they wanted to invest in the program, and sort of set the terms about what they wanted to do. But also, it meant a lot more around giving away more information than you usually would. So, we did this pretty extensive engagement program with all of our own internal stakeholders just about the program we were looking to build and the way we wanted to run the campaign and the research that informed it and the sort of strategy that sort of sat behind it. And it was sort of more detail than you would ever give to all the different levels of your party. And we were just more, we had to kind of get over the barrier of sharing information and go out and do it because we knew it would build more support. But I think that culture and attitude has maintained, and that has been pretty significant in terms of a massive culture shift for the way WA Labor Party operates. There are more people involved in campaigns now than ever before. I mean, some of the stats out of this election, they did monumental 250,000 doors and calls in electorates, and they had about 100,000 conversations in that election period in all those seats in Western Australia. And so I think it's maintained. I think there are more people sharing information, and I think it's keeping alive because people are having fun and they're enjoying being part of it, and we're seeing the results of it.
It's funny, because I remember when I first read David Plough's campaign biography called The Audacity of Winning, which was about Plough. For those who don't know who David Plough is, was the campaign director for Obama in 2008 and 2012 presidentials. And he talked about it in the 2008 campaign, both in the primary against Hillary, but also in the general, how they opened up, to your point, how they opened up the campaign to the community, that they shared the strategy with people, that they weren't fearful of that. And that was one of the biggest takeaways I had from that book. And then obviously going out and hanging out with folks from OFA. And that's something that we wanted to replicate in Victoria. And we did that. We used to run these strategy briefings with all of our volunteers, and what we call strategy Steves, all the blokes that all want to, that's me, I'll be in there for the strategy. We're there to tell them the strategy, and we did, absolutely. But then the next thing was, well, in order to enact that strategy, we need you to knock on some doors or make some calls. Our strategy is based around mobilising thousands of people on the doors. And fair enough, good people got the strategy and said, I get that. And yep, I can commit to that. But to your point about motivation, the lens upon which we seek to organise leadership flows through three things: head, heart, and hands. The head represents the strategic of how we think. The heart is the motivational side of how we think. And you need to engage both in order for the hands to be engaged, as in for someone to do something. If you can have the best strategy in the world, but if people aren't motivated about it and no one shows up, then it's a waste of a strategy. At the same time, you can have the most motivated people in the world, but if you've got no strategy, then it's a wasted resource, right? So, I think sometimes we do overlook the heart part of our work. And to your point, in your biggest takeaway from coming over to Victoria, that was a new thing for us. I think we were always good at the strategy stuff, right? But we just didn't take the time to build relationships with our volunteers, between a field organizer and the volunteers, but also the volunteers together, for them to build relationships with them. And public narrative is so critical in that. Their story of self, the story of us. Every time you're on a campaign, that is a moment of the story of us, and then the story of now. What is the urgent threat? What do we need to do to address that? So, public narrative, relationship building, and then bringing just that love and heart and courage into the work of campaigning is critically important. But sometimes people look at that and think that's American mumbo jumbo, and we'll skip over that. Did you find that? Because one thing I noticed about, I don't know if I've ever said this on the podcast, but I certainly say this in training when I talk about the 5 practices of community organising under the Gantz model. You can't be a cafeteria Catholic. I'm a cafeteria Catholic. I pick and choose bits of Catholicism that suits me, because if you did all of them, I'd never leave the house. You can't be a cafeteria organiser. You cannot pick and choose the bits of community organising that suit you. And a lot of campaigns at times they say, oh, we'll do the strategy bit. So we love DVC. We'll get out there, we'll knock on doors, and we're going to mobilise the same amount of people each time. But they don't take the time to build relationships, which then finds new resources, which finds new leadership. They don't bother with the leadership structure, or they may skip over public narrative because they think that's American mumbo jumbo. I don't know. But how did you find your experience trying to embed this work and getting people to embrace some of these fairly new concepts?
I guess it comes down to when you start to see results. And so there are a few things. So I'm trying to remember where we were. There must have been a conference in New South Wales, and there was a guy from the old New Organising Institute who was there presenting. And I remember there was this one night, we're in the dark corner of a pub, and I've got like a glass of red wine in my hand and on my head in my hand going, I don't know how I'm going to keep doing this. This is very, this is becoming such a real load on my shoulders now, and it's kind of getting really hard. And I think, you're trying to build a team, and you're trying to kind of get people to change the way they've been doing things for a very long time. And I remember sitting in this dark corner with this guy and just being like, what do you do? What do you think? What are your recommendations? And he very, very simply said something that stayed in my mind, and I've used it ever since, which is just work with the people that want to work with you, get results, and then find others. That attitude just changed the way we focused our efforts. So when I came back from whatever that conference was, I remember sitting in the office and just doing up a list of who's in and focusing on them and creating opportunities for them to come and participate and be part of things. So whether it was as campaign managers, field directors, field leaders, union secretaries that were into it, whatever it was, whoever was there, yes, that wasn't hard to convince, focus on them and see if we could use them to motivate others. Yeah. Once we just did that approach, and again, I feel like if you had asked me at the time, I'd devil in the detail around the negatives. But right now, following that result in WA on May 21, I can only see positives about the effort and overall effort, and how worth it was to just work with the people that want to work with you to make this change and make the change happen, to be clear about the outcomes, and to communicate the wins and share the wins together. The more we did that, the more people kind of had no choice and had to fold in. Like, you were with us or you were against us. It was a cult. It was fun. People were having fun. More people were doing it. And you were either with us or you weren't. So that became quite fun in the end. And you could just see, what I like now is when, these campaigns were getting set up, back a year ago or so, in the federal seats, they're still looking for field organisers in addition to campaign managers. That was a massive change in itself, because we never had a role called field organiser. We used to have somebody who used to be responsible for calling the volunteers and telling them what booth they were on election day, but we didn't have someone whose job it was to build community in every electorate. And now we do by default. And that's an amazing thing that has sort of stuck the entire time. But again, just that clear message of just working with the people that want to work with you, it delivers results. Trust the system, trust the program, it delivers results. And once you start to see those results of non-party members participating in campaigns, the amount of field activity, the feedback that you get from the ground and how that could be utilised in your campaign and campaign strategy, that people will see the benefit of it and they'll just jump on board.
A couple of things to pick up from you on that one. That person that you spoke to in the pub, I'm 99% certain it was Kwesi Chapman.
It is. I was going to say his name, but then I thought I didn't know. I have a high regard for Kwesi, and that simple advice just has dealt me a lot of good in my lifetime ever since then. So it works for field, it works for everything. Just like how persuasion conversations and volunteer recruitment conversation structures work for convincing my partner to take out the bins.
That's good. Carla Settle once said that the skills that she learned as a field organiser has replicated in many, many ways in her life. I don't know if it's extended as far as getting a partner to take out the bins, but I'm sure it's similar to that. Kwesi Chapman, for the listeners, has been on this show before, so you can go back and look at some of the episodes Kwesi's been on when we talked about US politics. He's a DC-based community organiser. The other thing I wanted to ask you about, this is something that, as we have been doing these episodes with wonderful people like yourself and talking to folks in each state on the ground and starting to analyse all the results, I'm coming to the view now, and I don't want to sound like Howard Dean and the 50 states, strategy, but and I know that you guys in WA didn't have, I looked at pretty much every single Labor held seat. I think you had swings on all of your primaries in all of your seats.
Yeah.
Whereas what we've noticed in Melbourne, Adelaide and Sydney, I can't remember about Queensland or Brisbane, but certainly those three cities, there was swings against Labor on our primary in both the inner city seats to the Greens and in the outer suburban seats to sort of all the right-wing nut jobs, right?
Yeah.
Where they weren't swings on our primary, in fact, where there were swings to us on our primary, was where there was a field program being run. And I'm now coming to the conclusion that those in safe Labor seats, if they're worried about losing votes to either the Greens or losing primary votes to One Nation or Palmer, and then them going back into the Liberal 2PP, I don't know if they can get away with just doing a carbon copy rollout campaign where they do one or two mail outs, maybe a postal vote form, and that's kind of it, and just take it easy. Because look, there are some, over the years, I've worked for the Labor Party for 20 years. I know this, and I've worked on one or two safe Labor seat campaigns. The candidates, some candidates or MPs, almost take a holiday. I don't think they can do that anymore. I think that time is over. And I actually think now, and I don't think they're going to get central funding for a field organiser. I think they're going to have to raise that money themselves. And I think they're going to have to invest in their own marginal seat campaign with a full 12-month strategy, or maybe even longer than that, really.
Longer, definitely.
But I'm thinking about what's the minimum we can get out of these campaigns. I think they had to start moving in that direction. I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Well, let me answer that. Let me answer that question without trying to annoy too many wonderful members in those safe seats. But let's look at it in WA. Freo, Brand and Burt, while those three MPs will probably never refer to their seats as safe seats, all saw a 10% swing towards them at this election. And I'll speak to all three of those MPs, and they will never refer to their seat as a safe seat. But as far as Western Australia federal ALP politics goes, those three seats will be our safe seats. What we've seen out of those three campaigns at this election was those seats not being taken for granted. They had substantial, what I would call more traditional forms of campaigning. So the New South Wales model, not the Victorian model, just communications out to the electorate, lots of retail politics out there, going to sort of large events and being seen by people, getting out, chatting to people in that sort of a little bit of an unstructured way. And I again, do not try to say this in any negative way, shape or form. I think that is a really good way to get out and do some community engagement in those particular areas. And I think those three MPs had a program of that effort that was pretty consistent. And they saw roughly between the three of them a 10% swing towards them. Now, Perth, the federal seat of Perth, where I live, and the wonderful Patrick Gorman is the federal member for my area. He had, and this is probably also I saw it a lot. I saw it a lot more because it is my local area, but he had a pretty substantial door knocking program as part of his campaign, and he got an 11.55% swing towards him. The seats of Cowan, Hasluck, Pearce, and Swan, where there was a substantial field campaign run, saw swings of 11, 14, 12%. And so, yes, there's some elements of demographics, and there was a swing on. But in the overall scheme of things, why did certain seats stand out? What was the point of difference in those seats? Whether you had an incumbent that was running in Hasluck, or an incumbent that wasn't running, like in Swan and Pearce, because you had a substantial field program, you saw a slightly larger swing towards those Labor candidates in those seats than where there wasn't a traditional, where there wasn't a kind of substantial field program being run in some of those safer seats. So what I will say to that is effort matters. Effort matters always. And I think I think in your I think you actually made this comment in your last podcast. So to quote you back to yourself, I think we've got to be kidding ourselves if we think that this is the trend. This isn't the trend. It feels great to have now seen a decade of growth in Western Australia of the primary, but let's be very clear, where I started my commentary was back in 2014, where we produced the graph that showed the trend of the primary in the Labor Party has only ever drifted downwards in Western Australia since the 1980s, with a couple of exceptions, which was the Hawke election and the Gallup election, and now the McGowan election and the Albanese election, that the overall majority is still a downward trend. And this is not a trend this is not a high and positive only trend going forward. I think there's some really strong signs, but I think anybody would be kidding themselves to think that what goes up doesn't come down. And there are a lot of things that we need to do to kind of retain the seats and continue, engaging and representing the community in the best of ways. And the only way that we could do that is by not ignoring seats or calling seats safe seats. And I hesitate to say this, but I will. It is also about not being 100% completely dismissive of the Liberals' safe seats. We know a few things about the overall benefit on return on investment in terms of your campaigning in seats that have not been campaigned for is usually higher. We know that where you can actually help increase your upper house vote is in seats where you don't traditionally campaign a lot. So your safe, held and unheld seats could be your best ground to pick up extra upper house votes or Senate votes, and we saw that in the election here in Western Australia as well, where Labor's picked up the third Senate spot for the first time since the 1950s, and that is because no seat gets taken for granted. Effort is shared across the board, and some of that is from a central campaign that chooses to allocate its resources in a very strategic way that capitalises on the different forms of channel of communications that you could use, that leverages digital to get out the message wider, that invests in radio advertising, television programs and other apps and things, so that you could try to get as much coverage above the line as possible, backed in with really strong field campaigns in those marginal seats that saw a much higher swing than seats that didn't have a big field campaign in them.
Let's turn our attention to the role that Mark McGowan played in the campaign. And I want to ask the question with reference to the small or little impact that the minor parties played in the overall primary vote in WA. The Greens, One Nation, Palmer, very little movement from the 2019 campaign to this one. There's a view, broadly speaking, that if you look at the results, as I said before, in Adelaide, Melbourne and Sydney, that there's swings against Labor on our primary. How much of a role do you think Mark McGowan has played in terms of his leadership, that people who, the same demographic of a person in, say, Broadmeadows in northern suburbs of Melbourne, that equivalent person in a suburb of Perth that you're going to have to name for me because I'm
Joondalup,
that have they voted Labor in Joondalup, but they didn't they gave their number one to someone else.
Mark McGowan has, I think, shown people in Western Australia that, what a good Labor government could do and could look like. And let's just talk about circumstance. So, and knock that on its head. So, COVID obviously created an opportunity for leaders to lead, and really demonstrate strong leadership. And this is where I think McGowan was able to shine. He is, battle hardened. He's been a member of Parliament since 1996. Before that, naval lawyer. He's got steely resolve and really finely attuned to community expectations and community sentiment. And what he was able to do is put that all on display for two solid years, navigating COVID in Western Australia. And frankly, the more people saw it, the more they loved it. And it's like every politician's dream to have people being able to watch, people interested and actually watching your press conferences. And think back to 2007. If someone wanted to watch your press conference, how would they have done it? I remember sitting on the Patterson campaign in 2007, and the message went out from National Office saying, "Hi, you might be contacted by individuals to suggest that you start up a webpage. Please don't do so, and get in touch with us, and we'll create you something that you don't have to worry about using." Or in 2010, when the message went out to all campaigns, like, please don't post anything on Facebook, to what it is now, right? And, to have people who wanted to watch daily press conferences actually be able to, because of various live streaming tools and platforms, they're able to see what, the leadership style of Mark McGowan. And what I think, so that I think was the opportunity that, kind of paved the way for his very high approval rating, very high popularity rating in Western Australia. But what they saw is someone who authentically is a champion of Western Australia. Knows he has to be one because he's originally from New South Wales, like all good Western Australians are. Thank you so much. So he is, and there's a lot of analysis and opinion about how he's done it and what he's done so well. I read a piece the other day, I think it was on WA Today, that was just sort of recapturing and reiterating that sort of no one is a greater champion of Western Australia than Mark McGowan, and here's why. And not that they were pushing editorial, they were just sort of explaining how he went about doing it. Now, go back to, when was it? Say 2016, 2017. The highest approval ratings I had ever seen in Western Australia in terms of community sentiment towards politicians that they absolutely trusted to be strong advocates of Western Australia were for Julie Bishop at sort of 70 to 80%, and Pauline Hanson at 70-ish%. Trusted sources. The next one underneath those two was Alana McTiernan, who's currently a minister in the state government. There was some pockets of local MPs who had sensationally high approval ratings because of being passionate and strong advocates for their areas. Peter Watson, who was the member for Albany, Mick Murray, who was the member for Collie Preston, both have retired at the 2021 election, or 2017, but both of these, at the 2021 election, but both of these MPs were seen as our local hero first. Julie Bishop was seen as a Western Australian advocate first. Pauline Hanson somehow seen as a passionate advocate for Western Australia. Now you have Mark McGowan, who has now solidified his reputation as Western Australian first. So I think that plays a massive part, and played a massive part in this federal election, in addition to overall sentiment against Scott Morrison, and a mood for change that was brewing across the country. And I remember doing that podcast with you pre-election to make some predictions about seats. And I guess the hard part for me was like having my head in two spaces. So I was trying to sort of say to you that I feel like something's really happening in Western Australia, but also I can't see it happening necessarily everywhere else. And I was trying to get my sense of like what's actually happening here and why is it different, and or is it different, or are we just sort of too close to it in Western Australia that we feel it's different and it's not. But in the end it was. And I think what it was about Western Australia is because we had the factor of Scott Morrison backing Clive Palmer against Western Australia, and such a message that was repeated so consistently throughout the campaign. I remember when Clive Palmer challenged Western Australia's border restrictions in court. When that happened, there wouldn't be a single soul who didn't know about it, who didn't immediately hate Clive Palmer for it. Stamp him firmly and clearly as someone who was against Western Australia and make their decision. And I think basically that was the kind of end of Palmer being able to do anything substantial from an electoral point of view in Western Australia. And then to have Scott Morrison and the Liberal Party back, no matter how they choose to explain it and justify why they had to do whatever they had to do, at the end of the day, they supported Clive Palmer in that proceeding, and Western Australians knew about it, and those who forgot about it were reminded of it at the election, which paves the ground, sort of softens the turf a little bit to say, well, then who for Western Australia? And up comes Mark McGowan, a passionate advocate for Western Australia, who says, we need good partners in Canberra, and points over at Anthony Albanese and the Labor Party and says, and that they are it. They stand up and say, we're going to be partners of Western Australia in Canberra. Are we going to stand up for Western Australia? And I think that message, I know I'm just repeating their messages, but that message as a combined thing really tapped into the sentiment that was out there, which was, look, I don't think we communicated a big, bold agenda for Western Australia at this election. I don't think we did, right? I don't think we needed to. I don't think the punters were looking for it. I think they were just looking for someone who, when they go over to Canberra, which we consider a little bit like NATO or the UN, it sort of sits over there, it makes all these decisions, and then somebody somehow comes over and tells us what the heck's going on. There's some key fundamentals. We don't want you to take all of our GST and not give any of it back to us. We don't want you to take us for granted in Western Australia. We want you to acknowledge that we were a powerhouse contributor to the economy. And because of the way we navigated COVID, by the way, we were really, really important to the overall sustainability of the economy as a country. So, thank you so much, everybody else, to Western Australia. And I think in that kind of combination of that sentiment of just not feeling overlooked, when you've got such a powerful leader like Mark McGowan saying, we need a partner and this is the partner we choose, how could you go past it? That kind of combination of things really taps into all that the Western Australians wanted to hear, was that someone was not going to ignore them. And then we had Western Australia's number one fan say, this other guy is number two.
It was like a trusted.
That's going to be powerful. Yeah.
There's been reports, I think I read an article in The Guardian, I think it was written by Catherine Murphy, talking about this campaign within a campaign in WA. And I think I've heard conflicting reports as to whether what level of agreement existed between the Western Australian branch and NatSec. But regardless of whose idea it was, did we see a very parochial Western Australian first campaign on the ground in those target seats that may have differed? I know it's hard for you to compare. I'm not sure if you saw, what type of campaign was being run on the East Coast, but was it very WA centric?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely it was. And I will say this, the mark of a good Western Australian campaign is one that has fights with its national office constantly. Like, if that's not happening, then no one's advocating for Western Australia. When we did the review in 2019, we went to every jurisdiction and we talked to, the kind of key people in the campaigns. We talked to candidates. We talked to rank and file, and we said, "Hey, what's your feedback? What happened in 2019?" And every jurisdiction outside of New South Wales and Victoria, and I'll explain why in a second, argued we needed a unique message for our state. I heard it in the Northern Territory, South Australia, Tassie. I heard it in Queensland. I heard it in WA. In WA, we've argued consistently for the need to run a WA first campaign now for many, many years. I think Tim Picton and Ellie Whittaker have been I will say it, the only successful party officials to do so. Backed by, backed themselves in and said, we will do it, we will resource it, and we will make it so. And I think a huge credit to them. I think it's a marker of a fantastic campaign in Western Australia to be able to say we need a localised message here and deliver on it. And I think we saw that in no uncertain terms. The bunting was Albanese and Mark McGowan. The ads were all WA, WA, WA. They were authorised locally. All the material was Western Australia first. The message was stand up for WA. Like the everything that I saw here was very much so targeted and tailored to Western Australia. And from my brief sort of looking into the other jurisdictions, I think there was elements of localised targeting, and there was elements of localised issues. Certainly some of the negatives were hyper targeted from both sides in local electorates and some statewide stuff that we saw, but nothing, I think, compared to the significant campaign that was run in Western Australia that was purely targeted to Western Australia. And I think it's a mark of success, and a huge credit again to Tim Picton and Ellie Whittaker for getting that over the line and navigating that. And good campaigns and good strategies come with good tension and good discussion. So, I don't want to play into any rumours or whatever, but I just think it's a mark of a very healthy campaign if you are having a genuine discussion and a tussle around strategy and what works. And credit to the Western Australians for winning that argument. And it was an argument, and I will back that in. But I will say this, the reason why that might feel different in New South Wales and Victoria is because you have traditionally, as big states, been able to resource your own campaigns. I know this from my New South Wales experience, is we, in an election campaign, you'd go to New South Wales head office, you wouldn't be on the phone regularly to the national office. And then when I came here and we did that first 2013 federal election campaign from WA, we relied heavily on the national office to kind of give us the direction and give us the sort of overarching message strategy and so on. And we needed that because of we're a small state, even though we're physically large, we were low on resources, and so we relied on the National Secretariat. And we needed to be part of the national campaign in order to pull it off. What I think we've been able to do over the years, and I again cannot tell you how amazing it is to have this feeling and to live in the great Labor state of Western Australia, is really stamp our mark, but then put up or shut up. So we back in with our own resourcing, and we deliver a localised campaign that works in Western Australia. We've got evidence, we've got resourcing, we've got the people to do it, we've got the capability and the capacity to do it, and that's a huge credit to everyone in WA Labor for really stepping up and owning our state.
Last question I want to ask you is about candidate pre-selection. I was interested to know the diversity of the candidates that were on the ballot and also then got elected as well coming out of the West. And I know that I would be guilty as being a woke Southern Mexican Victorian, whatever you want to call us, Melburnian, about sort of tropes about WA being, just full of cashed up bogans and expats from the UK. Shout out to my cousins, the Mullins from Clydebank, who are living up in Swan Valley. But clearly, the team that you're going to send to Parliament when it resumes is just as diverse as any of the MPs that are coming out of Victoria. Anyway, what's happened in the terms of the way that you pre-selected candidates in WA? One thing I actually you talked about training candidates who are thinking about being candidates is such a great idea, and it's something I've wanted to get off the ground here in Victoria for a while, and I love it. Tell me more about that as well.
Okay, let me start with that. because I think you're going to find this quite funny. So we had, I'm going to get the numbers wrong because it was now some time ago for me, right? But let's just say 20 participants or 25 participants went through a program that was actually initiated by the former and late member for Balcatta, John Kabelki, who is very dearly regarded by a lot of people, but also particularly me. My partner is the member for Balcatta, and we, hold John Kabelki in such high regard. And because of John, also, I've been able to meet, I have a professional coach that I, talk to and regularly bounce ideas off and sort of, use to kind of maintain my own regular commitment to professional development in my current career. And so beyond politics, and I met him through John Kabelki as well. So this guy had a passion for professional development, for training, and for helping people be the best they can be. And he initiated this idea, and we ran this program back then, and 25 people participated. It was like 10 sessions. There was some mentoring in between. We did sort of ethics training, policy development, how campaigns work, what does fundraising feel like and look like, all of that. And we sort of unpacked it all. We did, presentation training, personal story, all of it. In the end, we asked people if they were interested in being candidates. Only 3 said yes.
Yeah, there you go.
And as much as that was a bit sort of disheartening, it was actually quite a good thing, because how many times, Stephen, have you run campaigns where no one's briefed up the candidate on what to expect? Candidates just sort of thrown into the thick of it. And then they get all these calls from party office telling them to fundraise, and they've never had the experience of asking for money. They've never had the experience of someone slamming their door in the face. They've never had the experience of having to motivate or lead a team of people themselves, or being talked about in a third person while they're in the room. And so there's all of these things. And then that's just the campaign, let alone you get elected and suddenly you're part of this big group of people and you're sitting on this backbench, and, there's a questionable level of influence you have around policy, in that you think you're going to be in there writing policy papers, but it's just actually not what it's not what actually happens when you get elected. You have the ability to speak up, and you're all obviously closer to the power and to the decision makers, but you're not kind of in there kind of coming up with brand new ideas and sort of developing new strategies on how to address certain issues and stuff. It's just not the reality of what a job of a member of parliament is. And so I actually think this training session needs to be, this module needs to be rolled out everywhere, so that people are fully informed and fully aware of what they'd be committing themselves and what they'd be walking into. And I think out of that, you would get a more committed level of candidate, as someone who is, fully aware and fully capable of investing themselves, and knows the cost on them, knows the cost on their families, and can kind of mitigate some of that sort of time away from home and all of that sort of stuff. So I cannot recommend it enough. I think we need to be having these more open conversations about life as a member of parliament and what happens on campaigns, so that we get the best people that are ready to put themselves forward and into that position, and mitigate against kind of people getting a bit confronted by the whole experience a little bit as well. Let alone all the other challenges, like let alone everything else that comes your way when you're pre-selected. So I think it's very worthwhile, and I think we should do it more often. Now, to your question about diversity, Western Australia had, the Labor Party in Western Australia has had the strongest rules on affirmative action now for the longest period in the country. So led the charge. Now, I was trying to get my dates, trying to remind myself of the dates while I was getting ready to do this with you, but I just couldn't work it out, but it was in time. But it was led the charge. It would either be, in the 90s and set up some rules that had a carrot and a stick approach to AA. So affirmative action was put in the rules, and if the party didn't reach the affirmative action quota in pre-selections and in groups of pre-selections, the stick would come down and all positions would spill, all positions, not just the group. And so the carrot and stick approach focused people's minds. I reckon that would have been a tough debate back then. And credit to the party for leading the charge in that sense. And the other thing that the party did at the time is it gave, there's these, like interest groups in each jurisdiction. There's always a Labor women's interest group that exists in every jurisdiction. The Western Australian Labor Party gave that group votes on the caucus floor. On the state executive floor. And so now you've got delegates, you've got skin in the game, you've got a rule that gives you a carrot and stick approach, a hammer if you don't succeed. And I think what that rule did is, again, initiate a process where the party's culture changes on diversity, right? It's not necessarily about filling quotas. And I know that that's the argument that people who argue against quotas say is like, then you're just it's not merit-based, you're just taking people to fill positions. But what it actually did was instill the culture, embed in people's minds that if you want to come here to play, you come here to play with affirmative action and diversity in mind. What I reckon I've noticed in Western Australia, which is different from other branches that I'm a little bit familiar with, is that our leaders across the party proactively look for diversity in their candidates. They don't put up candidates of one gender, one persuasion, and sort of double down and back them in as a general rule. Diversity is embedded in what the leaders do. And by that, let me just say it really clearly and bluntly. Any factional leader is in Western Australia always looks for diversity in their candidate mix and who they put up for pre-selection. Union secretaries are doing that. The state leader and leadership of the government encourage it, look for it, look and ask for it, ask the factional leaders and the union secretaries and the rank and file to put forward diversity candidates. It is naturally embedded in the way we do things. And so I reflect on that and I say that kind of carrot and stick approach and that hard rule that went in early and which is now increased in the kind of a quota over time. So I think the first one, it was 30%, at least 30%. Eventually, I remember when I first came here, the rule was 40% for women and 40% for men. Like it was like very determined. Now it just says 50%. And the National ALP conference that changed and put in the progression to go from 40, 45 to 50, we put that in and put it in on a faster timeline to just kind of get on with it and get underway. Everybody here, it's second nature for all of the people who are out there looking for candidates or talking to people who are interested in becoming members of parliament, always say, our priority is to look for, good quality candidates that are exceptional local representatives and so on, who are, smart policy thinkers, who represent a diverse electorate and are, diverse themselves. So I think that having the tough conversation, the tough challenge decades ago has paid off. And it's embedded now within our culture to look for those good candidates. I think the challenge for us going forward is to know that diversity is more than just gender. I think we need to challenge ourselves. We're doing well, but we could always do better. We need to challenge ourselves to be more representative of, multicultural, various levels of disability, Indigenous, representative and voices. We need to kind of look for those people and put them forward. And that's our kind of next challenge. But I will say that one of the kind of jewels in the crown of this election was actually to also see NRL become a minister in the government. And I remember in her campaign when she first ran in 2016, there was a lot of personal attacks on her for being Muslim, and she really rose above it. And you've met her, and she has a fantastic attitude. And I think it's been, one of the most amazing things to see is her becoming a minister, and becoming a minister from Western Australia, and representing the seat of Cowan, where she was, she's had a couple of really close battles in that seat. And also, of course, Senator Pat Dodson, who, is about to lead one of the most, most important conversations we are going to have as a country, which is Illaru's Statement of the Heart and the recognition of Indigenous people in Australia. And here he is, the Senator for Western Australia, who is going to be leading that charge. So we're doing well, but there's always room to do better.
And we did, when we did the preview episode, we talked about Cowan and Ali's seat. And whilst we were looking at a whole bunch of seats we wanted Labor to pick up, we were at the back of our minds were going, geez, I hope Anne's going to be okay. But she had a whopping 9% swing through on her primary, holds the seat by 60% now. So, and now in the ministry, which has just been a fantastic result. And I just want to echo your sentiments, a jewel in the crown of what's been. It was a great night for the party in the West, and bringing it home for us. In the words of Vanessa Williams, you've saved the best for last, Lenda. This has been a fantastic episode. I've really, really enjoyed the chat. I know we didn't, we kind of broke away from the tradition of how I've done all the other episodes and just had a bit of a yarn. And I just really enjoyed it. And I hope, I'm sure our audience will have as well. I've left a whole bunch of questions on the floor because we just don't have time. But thanks so much for coming on the show again today. And giving us a great analysis and breakdown of the foundations for success that we saw on election night. It's been a great episode.
Wonderful. Thanks for having me.
Hey there. Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button, and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. And to get all the latest updates on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday.